Continuing on from our first and second parts of this series, we will now take a look at the biggest maps in video games from number 15 to number 1. Let's get started. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, 235 square kilometers. Black Flag took the beloved naval concepts introduced in Assassin's Creed 3 and turned them into its central hook, structuring the entire game around exploring and looting in the seas. As a result, it had to go considerably larger. Its total map size of 235 square kilometers is staggering, and though a huge portion of that is covered in water, given how excellent naval traversal and combat in Black Flag is, that really isn't a knock against it. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, 256 square kilometers. This right here is the largest Assassin's Creed game Ubisoft has ever made, taking the Origins template and expanding it beyond belief, while also pulling in the best bits of Black Flag and its naval focus. Odyssey is the best of both worlds. Its ancient Greece is gargantuan at a size of 256 square kilometers, though it is worth noting that a good portion of this map too is covered in water. Arma 3, Altus, 270 square kilometers. The rocky volcanic island of Altus is almost a perfect representation of everything Arma 3 is about. Its large and open expanses allow for some of the best tactical shooting action you can find anywhere, while its size by itself is also a force to be reckoned with. 270 square kilometers for a single map? Well, you don't see that very often. Operation Flashpoint Dragon Rising, 350 square kilometers. Codemasters' military sim Operation Flashpoint Dragon Rising was a flawed game for sure, but in spite of its flaws, it was a pretty good experience all around, at least if you're into that genre. Its map, which was roughly 350 square kilometers in size, was a huge one, though there are certainly some that would say that it was maybe unnecessarily huge and didn't do much with all of that space. Xenoblade Chronicles X, 399 square kilometers. Rather than focusing on narrative and characters the way Xenoblade Chronicles games usually do, Chronicles X was out and out an explorer's paradise, with a massive and varied map rife with opportunities for exploration and grinding. At 399 square kilometers, it is easily the biggest Xenoblade game to date. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands, 440 square kilometers. Ubisoft took Ghost Recon in an open-world direction with Wildlands in 2017, and though the game isn't without its flaws, there's no denying that its massive world is full of activities that you can lose dozens upon dozens of hours to, especially if you play it with friends. With a map that is 440 square kilometers in size, it is by far one of the largest worlds Ubisoft has ever built. Burnout Paradise, 518 square kilometers. Back when the trend of open-world racers, or open-world games in general for that matter, wasn't nearly as popular as it is now, Criterion turned Burnout into an open-world paradise, and it was massive, with a size of 518 square kilometers, which was a size that it used very, very well. It's too bad that this was the last we would see of this excellent franchise. True Crime Streets of LA, 622 square kilometers. GTA clones were a dime a dozen back during the PS2 era, and though True Crime Streets of LA was largely forgettable in that saturated crowd, it did manage to do one thing that would help it stand out, at least a little bit. It had a ridiculously big world. At 622 square kilometers, this was beyond impressive, especially for a PS2 game. Just Cause 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1,030 square kilometers. The Just Cause series has changed in several ways since its inception, but one area where it's always been ambitious and didn't really need to grow is the sheer size of its worlds. All 4 Just Cause games till now have been massive, with each of their maps standing at sizes roughly 1,030 square kilometers each, give or take a handful here and there. Test Drive Unlimited, 1,600 square kilometers. To this day, Atari's Test Drive Unlimited stands as one of the best racing games for a whole lot of people, and for good reason. The game's biggest draw was its gargantuan world, which was a draw it used very well, because it banked on its open-ended nature heavily. Simply exploring its world, 1,600 square kilometers in size, was a joy and provided almost endless replayability. Final Fantasy XV, 1,813 square kilometers. After the disappointing Final Fantasy XIII, with the long-awaited Final Fantasy XV, Square Enix went back to the open-world approach that had been so well received in Final Fantasy XII, and it was one of the best decisions they could have made. At 1,813 square kilometers, the world of Final Fantasy XV is staggeringly large, but the real strength of the game lies in how varied and beautiful that world feels, making exploring it something that you actually want to do. The Crew, 4,920 square kilometers. Ubisoft's The Crew is far from a perfect game, but its ambitions cannot be denied. It puts players in a truncated recreation of the entirety of the United States and gives them complete freedom to do whatever they want. That said, it doesn't always utilize its map size of 4,920 square kilometers as well as it could and maybe should. The Crew 2, 5,700 square kilometers. The Crew 2 does what every sequel tries to do. It goes bigger, but its achievements are that much more impressive because, well, how do you go bigger than 4,920 square kilometers? By having a map that is 5,700 square kilometers in size. That's how. Like its predecessor, the Crew 2's map can feel a bit empty at times, but still, driving, boating, flying around the map, and taking in the sights can be quite enjoyable. Fuel, 14,400 square kilometers. Yes, yet another open world racer. This one is just bonkers. Asobo Studios' 2009 post-apocalyptic Mad Max-style open-world racing game Fuel was an ambitious title, and though it's fair to say that it didn't do justice to all of those ambitions, it will regardless always be remembered for the size of its world, if nothing else, which spans 14,400 square kilometers. The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, 161,600 square kilometers. The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall's entire map size was 161,600 square kilometers. No matter what game you're talking about, no matter who made it, no matter when that game came out, that is a ridiculously staggering number. It's worth noting that instead of hand designing the full map, most of Daggerfall's map, the country wilderness, was procedurally generated during development. This isn't to say that the game's map is random, mind you. The map itself is static, which means that towns and cities and landmarks and locations always stay where they are. It was only during development that procedural generation was used to create the bulk of it. Still, 161,600 square kilometers? That's simply insane. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.